Well, a snowy day, roads are messy, cars off the road everywhere. It's crazy out there, don't you think? It was nuts. No, you didn't see that?
Well, I was like, that's not good.
Oh. Anyway, it's winter. And I think I was saying the first class how we have a lot of great winter driving stories to nutrient management class and like trying to get home, having mega snowstorms up in Craftsbury during class, plowing snow with the tiniest of cars all the way back to Franklin County or Burlington. Anyway, so lots of great times. And I'm sure, Jeff, you had an adventure going over to Newport this morning. But anyway,
there's some out-of-state plates that should not be on the road.
Those out-of-staters, anyway. All right, well, today, so we're in class 3. There's 3 more classes after this. And really, this week and next week, we will go over all the information that goes into GoCrop. So today will be another big data entry point, lots of stuff to get into GoCrop. So you're gonna keep kind of populating your fields with information. So last week you were putting in each individual field, and this week you're gonna put in more information about each field. Soil type, what crop you plan to grow there, if that field has a rotation. And if you remember back to the first day where we were going over soil loss numbers, and going over see what else did we talk about? And soil loss for each year in the rotation, the data from that day will go in to GoCrop this week. Plus the crops that you're gonna grow and some information about the crops themselves. So Lindsay will get us into GoCrop once we talk about nitrogen. So today is our nitrogen day. And see, last week we talked about phosphorus. Next week, we're gonna talk about soil health more. Kind of try to look at the soil more holistically. And then we'll end kind of talking about micronutrients and potassium. And the reason we kind of leave those for last, not that they're not important, is that they're not considered environmental contaminants or risky to the environment. So, you know, you're planning to maybe add those nutrients to the soil, but you know, we don't have risk assessments. We don't really look at loss of those nutrients from an environmental perspective. So we kind of cover those last. Again, they're really important, but from an environmental perspective, we're not as concerned about those. All right, so nitrogen is a really fascinating nutrient. They're all a little different. Okay. Someday I'll tell you guys a story about how I thought I invented the smart board. Yeah. In nutrient management class. Anyway, it's a story for later. But it's great when you think you can magically invent something just by touching it. I said, wouldn't that be cool if you could just touch the board and things would appear and things would move? And it must have been the first smart board in the state of Vermont or something. I didn't even know they existed.
Yeah.
It was in St. Johnsbury. All of a sudden, my slides started moving. It's like, oh my goodness, it happened. It happened. Anyway, apparently somebody had already beat me to it. Okay, well, so nitrogen, let's get to that. Like phosphorus, like all the nutrients we'll talk about and not talk about, I guess, is that they're essential. And nitrogen makes up many of the, you know, common things we think about when we think about plants, animals, people, amino acids, proteins, nucleic acids, Obviously, they're critical to the function of organisms in general. As I mentioned last week, your plants will only take up two forms of nitrogen, and it's too bad they didn't take up the most abundant form, which is N2 gas, because there's a lot of it in the air. And if plants were able to utilize that readily, we wouldn't be worried about constantly meeting their nitrogen needs. So nitrogen is generally considered for most agricultural systems the most limiting nutrient. And it's, like I said, it's kind of ironic because 78% of the air is nitrogen gas. So how do we get that gas basically out of the air and turn it into those two forms that plants can use? That's a question. Any answers?
Lightning.
Lightning. Oh, that's a good one. Now, you know, there is this new manure technology called N2, which basically creates lightning to convert N2 gas into usable forms through this process that manure is put through. Anyway. Lightning. Any other? We need more lightning. We don't get that much lightning anymore. We used to get more lightning. What's going on with that? Anybody know? No. Anyway. Come on. Yeah, legumes. So, or bacteria, right? Bacteria, so microorganisms, very specific ones, can take gas basically from the air, from the soil air, and transform that into nitrogen that plants can use. And then there's another way, probably the most common way that agriculture uses today. A synthetic way, right? The Haber-Bosch process. So most of the nitrogen today embodied in plants that we eat, or any foods that we eat, comes through this synthetic process that was, I think, developed during World War I, too. No. Lindsay, I feel like you must have that. Somebody has.
I think it was between them, but
Between
definitely
them.
World War II. Yeah.
Yeah, it was like for bombs, right? So anyway, but a great finding to take nitrogen gas out of the air and convert that into other forms. And essentially that was sort of the start of taking nitrogen gas out of the air and turning it into fertilizers. N2 gas, you know, it's a little bit shocking, I guess, right? That it's N with a triple bond, three little lines between two ends. That's kind of the chemical formula. That it takes a ton of energy to break that triple bond, which is what you have to do to make these conversions. And so I myself find it fascinating that a dinky microscopic bacteria can do that. Or, you know, we use tons of energy and natural gas to do it and produce synthetic nitrogen. Now, I don't know why we're not just harnessing the power of the bacteria. It seems like it'd be cheaper. Like little bacteria farms on little treadmills. Breaking.
Like ant farms.
Yeah, anyway. But it is fascinating, right? So to make chemical fertilizers, it takes a ton of energy, which is why when energy prices go up, fertilizer prices go up, because it takes a lot of energy to make fertilizers, especially nitrogen fertilizers, but any really for that matter. So to take that N2 gas out of the atmosphere, these microorganisms can do it, not just rhizobia. There's a few other as well. But that's one of the primary ones in agriculture. And then, you know, or we can like do it synthetically in big factories with lots of petroleum. So as a farmer, you know, you have the power to harness and farm these little bacteria that can do this for you. It's kind of a crazy thing, you know, and if you think about that kind of power that you have, um, you know, it's funny to me that people don't utilize it more. Right? There's a lot of fertilizer bought for farms today, and nitrogen fertilizer. It's very expensive. It's one of the primary biggest expenses likely for crop farmers. And part of the reason people don't use, you know, legumes and bacteria to produce their own nitrogen is because there's, you know, sort of a feeling often that it doesn't make economic sense, you know, because you have to grow a legume in your rotation to be able to do that. Our tech person just arrived. Okay, so it's okay.
You know where to find farmers at this time of day? Walmart. 3 of them.
Maybe.
Took a little bit longer than I expected.
You farmers at Walmart. I know that's when Jeff shops at Walmart, right, Jeff?
I know, but I turned around and I was like,
I don't know where this goes. You guys know where that goes? It goes right there. Or on the other side. Let's go right there. Let's go upside down.
I'm trying to find years ago, I listened to this really good podcast.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
His life and how complicated of a human being he was in terms of the poisonous gases that he created in World War One, and they were like, this is not a part of our war system. He was like, I'm just gonna go try.
That is not, I hate to say this, but I don't know if you have a,
oh, you know what? It's right back.
oh. Okay. So Haber, that was his first name?
No, I think it's like 2 people created, but and he thought that you could harvest like gold from the ocean and poured a lot of resources into that.
Cool.
I'll try to see if I can find it.
Yeah. I think one day I was writing to nutrient management class a long time ago, and they were talking about how, you know, pre 1940, most of the foods that you would eat had leguminous nitrogen in them. And then after 1940 something or other, most all of the foods we eat come from
Ammonia.
synthetic
Yeah.
nitrogen.
Probably something that's crazy.
Okay.
Yeah, he wasn't a really good guy though.
He was crazy.
He was not nice.
All right, well,
But he
he's
invented
dead
this.
now.
Yeah.
That was mean. I'm sorry. Okay. So the nitrogen cycle itself it's pretty complicated. The thing about nitrogen also that is fascinating is, you know, once you're in the soil, and really, I guess, well, yeah, in the soil, nitrogen and nitrogen transformations are almost 100% biologically driven, which is really different than any of the other nutrients. That biology influences all of these different conversions. There's, you know, every step of the way, some kind of bacterial or fungal or other organism influencing the nitrogen cycle. So because it's so biologically driven, so it's driven by living organisms, it's hard to control. Like, we don't have a lot of control over what they do and when they do it and how they want to do it and how many are there. We have a little bit of control. There are some things that we can do to influence the nitrogen cycle. We talked about one of those last week, which was adjusting the pH, right? Because some of the microorganisms that are involved in some of these transformations like certain conditions. And so if you create those conditions, they're more apt to be present, they're more apt to be active, and more apt to be sort of working for you and what you need on your farm. And because there's so much influence of biology, you have to create a system to enhance, and that does enhance biology. You can see the lightning. See the lightning? Yeah, it is real. It's part of the nitrogen cycle. And actually, if you live out west, California, we did some work with nutrient management in California. They actually take nitrogen credits in their nutrient management plans for lightning strikes. So, yeah, I don't know if they go out there and 10 lightning strikes, 30 pounds of nitrogen. Okay, so it's, pretty complex. Lots of places, along the way where we're seeing nitrogen move from one form to the other. And also lots of different places, along the cycle where you can have losses. So it's converting from one form to the other. And when those different forms of nitrogen are available, if a plant isn't there to consume them, they may be more prone to leaching, or in some cases, more prone to conversion by other microbes to different forms. So here's the N2 gas up here in the corner, atmospheric nitrogen, and you can see it gets down into the ground a couple of different ways. So lightning fixation, as was already mentioned, and then through bacterial fixation, right? So bacteria, certain ones can take the nitrogen out of the air, soil air. So you gotta have air in your soil, right? And convert that to plant available forms. You also have fertilizers that we already said come from a process that is, a synthetic process that takes the N2 gas and turns it into different nitrogenous fertilizers. Of course, we have nitrogen bound to organic matter as well. So if you have livestock on your farm, you'll be calculating how much nitrogen is in that manure. Or if you have a plow down legume, let's say, right? Or sod, or some kind of living material that has nitrogen in it. Okay, so we already said, proteins, nucleic acids, et cetera, in the plant have nitrogen in them, and animals too, and, microorganisms. So when they die, that gets converted into hopefully plant available forms. All right. So a lot of the nitrogen we have in our soil is connected to carbon in organic matter. And this R is, I don't know why R equals C. R
Things like
carbon.
a complex carbon compound.
Yeah, anyway, that's a good point, instead of saying C, because C is just carbon. So R stands for a complex carbon compound with some nitrogen attached to it. And in order for this nitrogen to become available to your plants, it has to be converted into nitrates or ammonium. So your plants can't just come over to a piece of organic matter and grab onto it with their root and open its mouth and start chewing on it. That would be cool if it could, but it can't. Okay, so we have to get this nitrogen off of the organic matter, and then that needs to be converted into a plant available form. So how does this get kind of lobbed off of the organic matter? Okay, through a process that we call mineralization. So mineralization of nitrogen, mineralization of nutrients. And this is a biological process. And it's pretty complex, right? It starts with, let's say, the cow dropping a cow patty. And then you go over to the cow patty and you take your foot and you kind of smear it. And there's a bunch of little dung beetles in there, right? And you can see all kinds of stuff moving. So they're eating it, okay? And they're maybe defecating or breaking up pieces into smaller pieces. Then you have the next part of the food web, and then the next part, and the next part, and the next part. And then eventually you start to get the release of, I would say, their byproducts, right? So you get the conversion of organic nitrogen to ammonium. Now, once you're in the ammonium form, Plants can take this up, but I had already mentioned last week, they don't really like it as much. It's, energy intensive for them to utilize ammonium. It's kind of like if you have livestock, it's same way in cows. It takes energy to break down this type of nitrogen. Okay, so it does in plants too. So they would prefer to take up nitrates. So to get the ammonium to the nitrate form, it has to go through a couple of steps. And both of these are biological steps. So it takes bacteria to convert ammonium to nitrates and another bacteria to convert the nitrite to the nitrate. So you need to have these very specific bacteria for this process to happen. So mineralization is biologically diverse, I guess. You need a lot of different types of biology for this to happen and eventually form ammonium. But for ammonium to be converted to nitrites and then on to nitrates, that's very specific biology, very specific bacteria. Now, during this process, you can actually see the loss of N2 gas or nitrous oxide, which I think a lot of people now know what nitrous oxide is because it's the most powerful greenhouse gas that exists. And so we are trying to manage that very closely in agriculture and reduce the amount of nitrous oxide that's released into the atmosphere. A lot of nitrous oxide that comes out of agricultural systems comes from fertilizers, but a lot of it comes from manure. And really, we see this through a process called denitrification. And denitrification is an anaerobic process. So this is all aerobic, which means it requires oxygen. Okay, so remember I said you have to have air in your soil, so it requires oxygen. But when you have saturated soils, even in tiny little microsites, you get the conversion to nitrous oxide. Okay, and that's a loss too. And on clay soils like we have here in St. Albans Bay, Addison County, those areas, a lot of the loss of nitrogen that we see out of those soils is from denitrification because they become saturated really easily. Okay. In lighter textured soils, we worry about nitrates leaching, right? So you hear that term a lot. Oh, they leached out of the soil. Potassium leached out, nitrates leached out. So if you're up in Highgate area, you know, there's a sandy section up that way, very, very sandy, almost like beach sand. You worry about losing nitrogen to leaching, which means it just goes straight down through the soil. Okay. So remember last week we talked about the cation exchange capacity and the ability for your soils to hold on to negatively charged, I'm sure you all remember this, or positively charged nutrients. Okay. You can see nitrates do not have a positive charge. Okay, so they're kind of repelled by the soil. There is anionic exchange as well, but it's far less in the soil. So nitrates are prone to leaching because the soil isn't like holding on to them at all. So unless a plant takes up the nitrates or it's converted to some other form, okay, used by the microbes, it's very prone to leaching, especially in light textured soils. In heavy textured soils, it would be prone to denitrification. Okay, so all of this is happening at all times. And it's driven by moisture, air, temperature, soil type, and the type of materials that you're applying to the field. And it's hard to control, which is why if you're an organic producer, it's hard to get just the right amount of nitrogen when you want it. Okay. If you're using synthetic fertilizers, you can add ammonium, okay, or nitrates exactly when you need it. And the plants can take those up. But when you are only farming with biological nitrogen, you are playing like the lottery. You know, you're trying to predict when all of this is gonna happen and how much of it am I gonna get? And it's super complicated. Because how much will be mineralized into these forms is completely dependent on all kinds of factors. You know, right down to the very type of material you put on the soil and how green it was. Okay, so we're gonna get into this and trying to estimate how much nitrogen we're gonna get out of some of the organic materials you add to the soil. Manure is the primary one, okay? Because some of the organic nitrogen gets broken down really fast, some of it goes really slow, okay? And in manure, you already have some ammonium already. So we're looking at something very complex inside something else that's very complex and trying to predict how much nitrogen we're gonna get. So if you're wondering why nitrogen doesn't appear on your soil test, that's why. There is absolutely no way for us to, with any confidence, take a soil test like 3 years ago, measure nitrogen and tell you what it's gonna be. You really like kind of need to measure it every moment of the day because it's constantly changing and evolving. Okay. Which is not going to give you a whole lot of confidence in the future things we talk about. But in some ways, just knowing is half the battle. When you understand how all of this works and functions, then you can make better management decisions on your farm. So if it rains a lot, you know that that nitrogen you put on might have gotten lost through any of these mechanisms. And maybe what you had predicted isn't a great prediction when we have triple the amount of rainfall, okay? Or maybe it's really cold, etc. All right. Why doesn't that just move? I should just move. I bet. Touch that. It doesn't look like that. I know, I would have invented a touchscreen TV.
It probably does exist, doesn't it?
I'm sure it does. Just, okay, so, again, there are a lot of, living organisms at play here when we're talking about organic matter and the release of nitrogen. And it's really complicated. And some people try to measure this. You know, I've always been of the, I guess, in the camp of, well, you know, if you build it and you build the environment that is good for living organisms, they will be there, right? You don't necessarily need to measure these things using fancy tests. Just going out and looking at the soil is just a good thing to do so that you can see, is there life? Can I smell it? Can I see it? You can't see everything, obviously, but a lot of things you can see that you wouldn't expect. And every single one of those is playing a role in breaking down organic matter and making those nutrients available to your crops. So biological diversity is really key in the overall function of the soil, but also in making these nutrients available to your crops. Okay, so just to recap, I won't take as long this time. Plant available nitrogen, ammonium, and nitrate. We already said prefers nitrates. Right, mineralization is the conversion of organic nitrogen for most people. That's manure, livestock manure, or compost, or some kind of crop residues, and legumes as an example. Okay, so it's the conversion of organic nitrogen by soil life to plant available forms, the primary one, ammonium. Okay, in order for mineralization to sort of be at its best, you need to have the soil temperature over 50 degrees. So there's not a whole lot of mineralization going on today, right? And you need plenty of air, a good amount of moisture, okay, and a nice home. So you need places for the microbes to live, for the microbes to be protected, for them to hang out. So this is where this whole concept of kind of soil health comes into play, right? So we start thinking about the soil as a complex matrix where we need to have good physical structure and properties so that there is room for air, there's room for moisture, and there's room for the microbes to live and be protected. All right. So immobilization, which we didn't talk about before, is kind of the backwards reaction to mineralization. So mineralization, the microbes are breaking down the organic matter and making nitrogen in the plant available form of ammonium. With immobilization, it goes backwards. So, and the reason I talk about this in class is because this is very common on farms and people don't understand why. So if you have a livestock operation and let's say, or you have horses maybe, or you have calves and you're using a lot of sawdust. So you bed the calves with sawdust or maybe, even the cows or the horses, whatever kind of animals you have, or straw, right? So those organic materials are really high in carbon. Okay, and there's not a lot of nitrogen in sawdust. It's a lot of carbon, right? So even if you're bedding calves with it and the calves do their business on it, and so you're adding some nitrogen to it and some other nutrients, when you put that into the soil and the microbes head over there to start breaking it down, they actually need more protein, more nitrogen to be able to start eating on that carbon. Okay, there's not enough there for them. So they look around and anything that's available hanging out in the soil, they start to utilize so that they can break that sawdust down. So you see the opposite reaction, okay? And so what ends up happening is if you have a garden, vegetables, whatever, corn, even hay, and you've put a lot of this type of material out there, and you try to grow something, it doesn't grow very well. It's really yellow and maybe even a little stunted. And you're thinking, why the heck is that happening? Well, it's because it's completely nutrient deficient. Because the microbes are taking everything and they're really good at it. They're way better than the plants are. They're taking all the available nutrients to start breaking down the organic matter you added, which is great eventually, right? So eventually they'll get it done, okay? And then they'll die and they'll cycle and all of those nutrients will become available again. But it could be weeks, could be months, could be years, it depends what you're putting on there. So if you're going to use a material like that, don't put it on right before you plant because you're not going to be very happy. Your plants aren't going to be very happy. So you're better off to put those types of materials on in the fall, right? So if you have a heavy bedded, composted, like bedded pack, let's say, you would really want to put that on in the fall. So it has time to break down, sort of to equalize in the soil so that you don't end up harming kind of your crop productivity that next growing season. Okay. Immobilization, usually not the farmer's friend, but eventually it all kind of works itself out. Okay, nitrification again is that conversion of ammonium nitrogen to nitrates. One bacteria, okay, that does this, and that bacteria prefers temperatures over 50 degrees, right? Which is why in the early spring when it's still pretty cold, and maybe it's okay above ground, well, they're not living above ground, right? So if it's still 45, 49, even really 50, things are moving pretty slow. So you might see your plants kind of reflect that because they're not getting what they need. Nothing is really working. Everything's going pretty slow. You need a pH near 7. We talked about this last week. And again, You need a nice environment for these microbes to be able to thrive. Okay, denitrification is taking ammonium and converting it to nitrous oxide, or N2 gas. And this happens under no oxygen conditions or very low moisture conditions. This is again a specific set of bacteria that thrive under anaerobic conditions. And again, this can be just little tiny microsites even in the soil. It's always happening, but we see significant losses in really, really wet years where the soil will stay saturated for long periods of time. Okay, volatilization is a primary way that, besides leaching actually and denitrification, that in agriculture, we lose nitrogen. And volatilization generally happens or does happen when you apply nitrogen on the surface of the soil and it doesn't get incorporated. Okay, so if you're spreading manure on hay ground, that is prone to volatilizing the nitrogen. If you're spreading fertilizers on the surface, you know, on any crop, they could potentially volatilize. Okay, so again, this is plant available ammonium being converted by soil bacteria under very specific environmental conditions into ammonia gas. And in agriculture, with urea fertilizers in particular, this is where we see the majority of our losses during the year. So if you're applying a urea-based fertilizer on hay fields or cornfields, and the conditions are right, which is kind of this rapid drying. So the ground is kind of moist, it's hot, and it's windy. That's when you see a lot of volatilization. Okay, and again, it's just taking all that fertilizer you just put on the ground and converting it into a gas, which gets lost into the air. And when conditions are really ripe, you know, this can be 90% of your fertilizer just gone, just like that. So you are best actually in today's conditions to use some kind of protectant that will keep it from volatilizing, or use a different type of nitrogen other than an ammonium-based nitrogen. In manure, there's a lot of ammonium in liquid manure in particular, and that also, when it's spread on grass fields in the heat of the summer, we get a lot of loss into the air. So you'll see that when you start making your calculations. All right, so like I said, you need your soil livestock, so you need to make sure that you have a good environment for them, and we'll talk more about this next week, kind of what that looks like as we form aggregates. So in order to have high biological activity and good plant growth too, who needs that? No. You need to have soils that can breathe and can hold water and filter water as well, right? That's a big part of making sure that we have clean water around us. So what we're striving for are soils that are well aggregated. And so you can see here's a picture of that. These little stone looking things are not stones. You might think that in Vermont, that those are stones and not little soil aggregates. But these soil aggregates, okay, look like little pebbles, I guess, and they're all different shapes and sizes. And so when you have well aggregated soil, it'll look messy, right? It'll look kind of complex. And if you pick it up, it'll kind of crumble in your hand. You'll see all these little crumbles, okay? And so when you have this kind of soil structure, there's plenty of room you can see for air, right? To move down through the soil, be everywhere, and plenty of room for water too, okay? When you don't have that type of soil structure, well, you can see there really isn't any room for air. There isn't any room for water. And as a result of that, your plants aren't happy either. So we want to create this kind of environment, right? To have good biological activity. as well as good plant growth and good water quality too. Right, so how do you do that? Well, it's funny, you need to have this to have biology, but you also need to have biology to have this. So which came first? The biology or the aggregate? It's one of
chicken or the
life's
egg?
mysteries. Okay, so to get aggregates, you can't buy them, I don't think. Amazon sells everything, but I don't. We should Google that. They sell soil aggregates.
I'm on it.
Okay. To get aggregates, you need biology, and really it's the action of the biology in the soil, eating organic matter, cycling, the goos and the glues that come off of those microbes. And just think about an earthworm, how slimy that can be, right? Okay, so as the microorganisms are kind of eating, breaking down organic matter, they're making a mess. And then on top of that, you have plants growing and plant roots moving and they're searching out nutrients. Okay, so it forms this sort of complex little ball that we call an aggregate. So having those microbial glues is kind of what sticks the soil together to form those aggregates. And there's no right way to do it, I guess. You know, the microbes are just living. And as a result, we get this benefit of having these little soil clusters. I think of that cereal. What's that little cereal with the little clusters in them? You know what I mean? Honey bunches of O's or O's, they're so good with those little clusters. But you're like, "Ah, I hope I get a big cluster." But then there's all the little like tiny clusters and then the ones that are so small, I'm like, oh, is that even worth it? But that's kind of what's happening in the ground, you know, you're getting all these different size aggregates. And then they're stacking up on each other, you know, just naturally, creating that pore space that we need for air and water to move through the soil. Okay, now why this is important for the environment is when you have that pore space and airspace, when it rains, and we talked about this last week, right? When it rains, you want the water to go in the ground. That's key. This is key to our long-term success, right? Is that the water moves into the soil and filters through the soil. If it does not go into the soil, it's going across. It's got to go somewhere. It's either going to go down or it's just going to start moving across. So, you know, our job as landowners is to create the most permeable surface that we can. So that when we are getting those deluges, which are more frequent and more frequent, the water is going down. Okay. And the rain is hard. It's really hard on these little aggregates, okay? Especially when you're getting that intense rainfall. You know, you guys have seen these pictures where the raindrop hits the soil and the soil poofs up and, you know, it hurts the soil. It does. I think it cries and it doesn't complain, but you want these aggregates to be so strong that when those raindrops are hitting that soil so hard, they don't break. Okay, that means the glues have to be strong, the microbes have to be strong, they have to be constantly working without interruption. And you need a diversity of them to build that strength. Think of the three little pigs and that wolf, you know, how he blows the houses down. So the rainfall will do that if this isn't strong. When it's strong, it'll move down. That's what we want. When it's not, it shatters the surface, that seals shut, and the water just starts moving right across. And then it starts picking up speed. It starts picking up these little soil particles. What's stuck to the soil particles? Phosphorus, other nutrients, and then it's moving, going somewhere probably we don't want it to go. Okay? I feel like this is our biggest challenge in agriculture today. Our biggest challenge in the state of Vermont is to make the most porous soil that we can. That's what we have to get through these trying times that exist or don't, depending on who you ask. But we're getting more rainfall and it's more intense. And in order for us to protect our crops, protect our communities, that's the kind of soil we need. Okay, and it's driven by the biology. You know, here's just an example of what that looks like. Up close and personal, right here in Vermont. Aggregates after a lot of rain, 7 inches, like, I don't know. I was on the job not that many years when I saw this. And no aggregates. 7 inches of rain, right? So you can see immediately that soil, this is the next day. That soil still looks wet, definitely looks unhappy. There was stuff planted here, not growing, not drying out, probably never gonna grow. Probably gonna have to replant whatever was there. This next day drying, actually could see the crumbles were drying on the top. You could even hear the water moving down. You could hear it gurgling through the soil. Has anybody ever heard the water gurgle through soil? It's pretty cool, right? Anyway, this is our grand challenge. Okay, we need this. Very different, same soil type, very different management. Okay, good rotations. No rotation, lots of tillage, not a lot of tillage, okay? There's ways to protect the microbes, ways to build them, and then ways to protect the aggregates. How do you kill the aggregate? Chop it. Karate chop it. With implements, rototillers, plows, discs, okay? The action of, right? So every time you go through there with some type of tillage, you're breaking up aggregates. You're breaking up the microbes. Breaking up the family down there. Okay, I don't want anybody to feel guilty because I'm into tillage myself, but you know, it's thinking about it, right? Thinking about it and what you're doing and how much you're doing. You know, we used to always talk about recreational tillage, people going out to just get the soil moving, make that really nice seed bed. We don't have as much of that anymore. People really do understand like that not tilling as much is actually really good for the soil and the plants. So trying to protect these aggregates once you have them built is what you want to do. All right. So as far as nitrogen and losses, just to recap, we lose nitrogen into the air through volatilization. We lose nitrogen in runoff into the surface water, generally as ammonium or nitrates, and then we can lose into the groundwater as well through leaching. Should put also nitrous oxide from denitrification as well. All right. So back here, just one last quick look. Complicated, lots to think about, lots of ways we can influence the nitrogen cycle with management. And not just adding fertilizers, not just adding organic matter, right? You got to create that environment that makes all of this go. And when it's all going and it's functioning properly, you're also creating this kind of stable, aggregated soil that is more able to produce healthy plants and a healthy environment. All right. I think I don't want to take much more time because we need to talk about Go Crop. But just to maybe talk a little bit more about legumes and the relationship to bacteria. And just if you're not doing this, you should be. You should be utilizing legumes on your farm. You know, if you're growing grass, you should have legumes in with the grass. Okay, the legumes again are going to help create more nitrogen in the system naturally and keep you from having to apply as much to feed the grass. It's gonna make the yields higher and more productive. And then ultimately just be cycling more nitrogen, biological nitrogen through that system. And you can see these little balls on the roots. I'm sure most of you know that inside those little balls is the home of the bacteria. That's where they live. And this is a symbiotic relationship. And it's important to understand this when you're building your nutrient management plan, because the bacteria only will associate with the legume if the legume allows it to, right? So each organism is getting something out of this relationship, right? So the bacteria is getting energy from the legume. Okay, and the legume gets nitrogen from the bacteria. If you give the legume a lot of nitrogen, it no longer needs the bacteria, and it will stop forming that relationship. So this is why we'll say, oh, your legumes are lazy. Your legumes are getting lazy because you're applying too much manure to them, or you're applying too much nitrogen fertilizer. So they don't need to give up energy to do that. So just something to think about. Oh, no, that's her phone. Just something to think about as you're building your plan, right? If you want to have legumes and you want to harness this relationship, then you have to manage the amount of fertilizers that you're putting on those fields and crops. All right, I think I am going to end with that today. Next week, we'll talk more about the different types of nitrogen in manure, legumes, other crops too, and how we manage those and their availability to feed our crops. So we'll do that next week, and I'm gonna let Lindsay take over so she can show off what we're gonna do in Go Crop today.
All right, here we go. Can you folks hear me okay
Oh, you can
online?
do it right from there. She can. I just.
I'm gonna take your silence as yes, even though I should probably take it as a no.
Oh, do you?
We hear you fine, Lindsay.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Get some. We're gonna make it. Make it.
It's 25.
Yeah. Get our text situation set up here, and I will share my screen. Frozen on our end. Okay.
Did you mute yourself, Lindsay? Can't hear you.
Did I do it?
No, when I shared my Zoom, it's
It's okay.
it did something automatic that I
Okay.
didn't want it to. So here, can you hear me now, Susan?
Yes.
Perfect, thanks. Okay, so what I was saying is if for some reason you log into GoCrop today and your farm's not there, like you can see I have my fabulous farm, but if you don't see yours, don't fret. The only thing you'll need to do is to log out. And because we're still in that transition phase, you'll need to log out twice. So to do that, you'll go to account, click log out. It's gonna take you from the V4 to the V3 version, and then you're gonna click log out here. And then you're in the sign in page. So maybe you won't have that problem, but if you do, now you know how to fix it. So starting here, we'll log in. It'll take a little while. You can see I'm like spinning here to load my farm information. And like the farm you're working with. And just to reorient us again, because maybe it's been a week since you've seen Go Crop, we have our side menu over here. We have our planning records and farm asset sections. But we're just going to stick in planning today. Don't need to stray from that. That's where we're focused. And most likely, if you're creating a plan, you only have one plan there. So you'll click your 2025 annual plan. Then we've got our checklist. You can see we're kind of dotting around here a little bit. We finished our narrative section. We haven't started our nutrient sources or nutrient analyses or equipment. We'll come back to it some other time. But we did start entering our field details. And one thing that we can do now is like we have our list of our fields. You can see I've entered in my preliminary information for all my fields. It says complete here. If for some reason you entered a field and you don't want to see it anymore, it's not really a part of your system, you can always click this goodbye, this omit from plan button over here. And once I do that, you can see now that I have showing, which says included, and says one item is hidden by filters because I hid that field and it's like, you don't want to see this, you're omitting it from the plan. It takes it out. But if you ever want to see whatever fields or other things that you may have omitted, you can clear your filters, you see it's back. And in this case, I actually do want grandma's field included in my plan, so I'm going to click the plus button. But I do just want to take a moment because I think I've heard that some other folks are starting to have long field lists or other things that they're looking at and might be getting a little bit lost. So I do want to take a moment and just now show you what the filter system does. And this is our button for filters. It starts with the broadest at the top. It's like a little upside down triangle. You imagine like most of your things, the top button or top line, and then as you're querying, you're selecting narrow, narrow, narrow down. But just to show you what that looks like, I'm going to click the filter button. And you can see that now I can filter by completed, what is or is not included in my plan, things I have reviewed, if I want to look at just my own fields or just my leased fields, or if I have any, if I want to filter my field list by crop, I can also do that. So this can be really helpful if you have a long list of fields and you're like, well, I know I completed a lot of my information because it says complete, but what about my incomplete fields? I want to come back to look at just those and do your filter and say, you know what? I want to look at just my incomplete fields. I will show you what that looks like. That's not an option here because I don't have an incomplete field, but we'll do this. Save it. And now we can see that I have an incomplete field. So when I come to my filter section, I can say those are the only fields I want to see. In the event that you do filter your fields, that filter will stay throughout all your steps and will even stay within your, I'm gonna call this like circular list function, which is like if you click here, you can see that I have these, if I open up my field, you can see that my carets on either side of my field name are gray, meaning I can't cycle through anything because it's filtered just the ones that I filtered receive, which is incomplete. I only have one incomplete field, so I can't keep cycling through. I think it'll make a little bit more sense if I come back to my filtering system, which I can only do if I go back to my list, open up my filters and say, you know what? I want to show all of them. So I'm going to unclick incomplete. And you can see that I have this done button down here, but as I choose on the left, you can kind of see in gray, it just does it automatically as I'm clicking them. It's filtering through. So that is that. So now if I click on any of my fields, right, I can start going through my field list with the arrows. And remember, anytime we see a gray arrow, it means that's the end of the list. We can't go forward anymore, but we could go backwards. At any time we want to return to our field list, we click this little list icon right here. Okay. So we have our field list. Hopefully you've entered in that information. If you haven't, it will show it's complete, you can fill that out. And the other piece we'll look at today are the land, the risk manage, I think we did risk management last week. We'll look at crop rotations and crops. We'll skip soil tests yet again. We'll kind of punt that for next week when we hopefully will be able to import soil tests. So just sit tight on that for a moment. But for our land info, I'm gonna open up Grandma's field here, which you can see on the back of the list is complete. Playing around with this today so I can see what that looks like. And I've mapped it out. I scroll down, and what I've already done here is I told it to fill my soil information in based off of my mapped section. And so it fills all of this in for me, which is really nice. So you'll get to that point today too. But to see what that looks like, we'll cycle through our fields. I can give you a little bit more of a look of what that's like by clicking this little button over here, not going back to my field list. And now when I scroll to the top, this is my incomplete field. I'm going to skip this because I want to show you one where I actually have a field mapped here. Remember, my field that I have mapped for the field I'm on is going to be in red. The other fields that aren't a part of the field I'm looking at are going to be in orange. And I can say, you know what? I want to fill my soil information based on my field map. So now I went from blank to all of this stuff. Down here, it's pulling things from Surgo, from things off of the soil series fact sheet. Now, what you'll notice here is that this is a little funny because it's telling me what my soil type symbol is, 13B, for this particular example, but then it just says other for dominant soil type. And this it's not an error, it is, what happened in this example is that way back when I set up my GoCrop account, I said, hey, you know what? I'm based in St. Albans, Franklin County. I'm gonna like rock and roll there. But then when I actually mapped this field, it was in a different county. So in order to fix that, to kind of make this a little bit more in line, I'm just gonna change the county. I'm gonna change it to Rutland. That's where this is. And once I do that, then it gets rid of that other, because it knows which county I'm pulling from and has the dominant soil type here. There are some times when GoCrop can't pull all the information from Surgo for like this water table depth. And in that case, you might want to pull up a soil series fact sheet and you can just plug that in manually. 1 to 2 feet or wherever it says there. It might not also pull depth to bedrock. Again, you might want to consult a soil series fact sheet and you can choose the options there. And then these other two pieces are also things that you'll need to manually enter. The nitrogen leaching index, hopefully you'll have a map for that, or maybe it'll be on your spreadsheet, but you'll choose your nitrogen leaching index. We might have done this last week, but just a refresher. Choose the category that's most applicable. And then you'll enter your tolerable soil loss, or T. And again, this is from the soil series fact sheet. It's an inherent soil property. It's something that doesn't change from with management practices. So that there, and then elevation from your spreadsheet and your distance to stream, which hopefully is also from your spreadsheet. Your distance to stream should always be greater than 25 feet. 25 feet or greater should be your distance to stream. I'm going to save this. Don't forget to save any of the changes you make. And then, yep. No, okay. And if you're in this mode of your land info, you want to fill out your soil series based off your map type, you can just keep on clicking through the button. One other really nice feature, I'm going to go back to my list here. And let's say I know that my rectangle field, my square field, and my incomplete field all have the same soil type. And I don't want to go through each field and say, all right, well, I know the leaching index is low or moderate. You can just go to edit. And if those are the only things we want to change on it, we just go to that section and we'll put in the values that apply to the fields we've chosen. So up here, when I went back to my field list, I chose 3 fields. If you want a reminder of what those are, you'll click show selected to make sure that you are changing the data of the fields that it applies to. And as you can see, we can change, you don't have to change everything. You have the option to only change one field. Like, I'm using field as also like you're in fields, you're working with fields and nutrient management planning, like you've named your fields that you manage, but then I'm also using this as this little text box. I'll call it a text box and not a field. You can fill in your text boxes. You don't have to fill out all the text boxes or drop down menus on a form. You can choose just the ones that all are similar. I'm going to save those changes and let that go. And then we're going to move on to crop rotations because we've already done risk management last week. And just for a refresher, that's what this looks like. And similar, what I just showed with the land info is that if you have the same pieces of information that you need to enter for multiple fields, you'll click the fields they apply to, click edit and change those. And I do want to note here, right, that I chose incomplete, rectangle, and square field way back in land info. And that carries through as I continue to look through my list. So this go crop is like, well, all of these things were the same once, maybe they'll be the same again, and you want to keep processing through your plan like that. But if you don't want to do that, one really quick way to get rid of all of those check boxes instead of like individually clicking them is to go up here on the left, where it says select all, and so I'll just click twice, once to select everything and once to deselect everything. So going on to crops here. Just like any other new section we've gone into, we have this help text that starts, and it takes up almost half of our working pages. And it says, like, talks about how we can use our filters, which I went over a little bit earlier. That you don't have to put in all your information to save the form. And then we can also edit our fields, much like I showed you in land info, if you have the same rotation in a bunch of different fields. And then we can also go over the copy function as well. But I'm going to get rid of this help text so we can see more of our fields. And again, if at any time you're like, what was that? Like, what are the features that I can use to make this a little bit faster? You can bring back the help text by clicking the little question circular icon down here. And it'll just have a pop-up with the exact same stuff we just saw. 2 ways to get rid of it. You can click dismiss or you can click the X. So I'm going to show you a couple different examples of crop rotations. So I'm going to start with our rectangle field. And you can see I haven't started anything yet because it's all blank. And if you, for example, have a field that just has continuous corn, it's been corn, it will continue to be corn, you don't foresee any rotation, instead of just writing infinite corn, you're just going to put one. And in this case, I'm going to choose corn silage with cover crop. And then it's going to ask me for my annual soil loss. Hopefully you have a spreadsheet or your Russell 2 worksheet. Guess there's like, I don't know what you call this, Kate.
I don't know, printout worksheet. Yeah.
Printout. It's not a worksheet.
PDF.
You're not like filling out. So you might have a printout of your Russell 2 annual soil loss values. And in this case, because we only have one crop continuously, we only have one value. Russell 2 stands for Revised Universal Soil Loss Equation. And it's basically a model that tries to show the potential for soil to leave your field given the soil type, the management practices, and the climate. It's in tons per acre. So for example, maybe in this case, we might be losing 1.2, which we have the potential to lose 1.2 tons per acre off of this field, given the management practices, the soil type, and the climate. So I've put in my 1 year of rotation, which is in perpetuity. Did not say that correctly, but I think you got what I'm trying to say there. And then we're going to choose the current year in rotation. And because I only have one value up above, GoCrop will only show me one value below. So I'm going to click the only thing it's showing me. my current year in rotation will continue to be my current year in rotation. And then the Russell 2 rotation average soil loss. When I have just one crop in my rotation, it's going to be the same number that I put up here. This average soil loss number, which would be, if I had more in my rotation, would be adding all of my soil loss each year, dividing by the number of years I have in rotation. Needs to be below the tolerable soil loss in order for your plan to be in compliance. And remember, the tolerable soil loss is something that we entered in land info that comes from your soil series fact sheet. So save that. I want to go through a couple other examples. So we did on my rectangle field, corn silage with cover crop. On my square field, I'm going to put some hay. And again, we're gonna do continuous hay here, so it's been hay, it'll continue to be hay in the foreseeable future, so maybe my potential loss is gonna be much lower, something below 1. And again, it's permanent hay, continuous forage, we're just gonna only put 1 line there, choose my current year, only have 1 option. My Russell 2 annual soil loss is gonna be the same I put up here as it is below, and click save. I'm going to go back now, so I'm going to show you what it might look like if you had something that's multiple years of rotation. And it's going to take a minute here, right? So you might have a 10-year rotation, and maybe that's 4 years corn and 6 years hay. So what that's going to look like when I do that, this is how I think about it. You might approach it a little bit differently, but I'm going to put my crops in first and then my annual soil loss numbers. For you, it might make sense to do your corn, your crop, and your annual soil loss one right after another. I'm just going to go to my drop down here. It would be nice if Go Crop made like a little like calming music while you're going through this. If you could like set it, maybe calm, maybe you need some like motivational music, I don't know. All right, so I've got my 4 years of pay. I'm gonna do 1 more. Or 2 more actually, because I wanna have a 6 and 4 year rotation. One thing that you might have noticed here as I was scrolling through is I've just gone and done a bunch of hay, because that's very straightforward. But if you wanted to, you can be a little bit more explicit and say, you know, it's hay, it's new, I'm gonna reseed it. And then you can make it a little bit more definitive and say, when it's hay established for the rest of them. I think it's up to you and how you want to handle that. But sometimes it can be really nice as a reminder if you are going to reseed to keep it to choose.
Is there a difference between hay established and grass hay established? Like the Go Crop sign?
How Go Crop sees it? No, there is not really. I think that this might be a little bit of a legacy between to try to get at how users of Go Crop might think about their crops. So some folks might be like, is it hay? Is it grass hay established? Like just because there's also grass legume as a possibility as well to get at mixed. So for me, I like things to match, so I'm gonna go do that. That was a really good question. So there's lots of options in this drop-down menu. Choose the one that makes the most sense for you and your operation and how you think about it. I'm gonna put some slightly random numbers here. By like first year. So in this rotation, right, if I'm coming out of hay, going into corn, there's going to probably be some legacy soil health effects. So I might have, you know, some amount coming off of some potential for soil loss to come off my fields. And as that legacy soil health wanes or decreases from the hay, the years that it's spent in hay, my field may become more susceptible to erosion. And as my corn years increase, my potential for erosion may increase as well. May or may not it's very important to look at the printout of your Russells to get these individual numbers, but this is a year by year potential soil loss. And then depending on how you're seeding your hay, it might also be a rather potential big loss year. That perennial forage can take a while to establish. If you're planting with a nurse crop, it'll bring it down a little bit, but for this example, I'm gonna go kind of big. And again, these are just examples. I don't have a Russell in front of me, so just take these numbers with a grain of salt. But overall, as your years in hay go on, your potential for soil loss will decrease. Unlike the other examples that I showed you, each one of these years has a different potential for soil loss. And you're going to want to add all these up and then divide by the number of years in rotation, which in this case is 10. And then you're going to put that number down here. In this case, I'm just going to put a random number. This is not the average of those 10, but you can imagine that, you know, maybe it's something a little more complicated. And then we're going to choose our current year in rotation. And now, because we have more than one, we can see the list of everything that we put above. It's pretty important to try to get this as close to what is in your history and is in your plan. So you might be somebody who has had 10 years of corn silage, but this is the year you're rotating, and this is the rotation you're planning on having going forward. So if that's the case, you would probably choose new hay if you're planning into going into perennial forage this year. Or maybe again, you've been in corn silage for 9 years or 10 years, and you're thinking, you know what, I want to get one more year of corn silage, and next year I'm going to go to new hay. I would choose 4 for this. So the rotation you choose to put into go crop should be the rotation you're planning on doing going into the future, and then choosing the year that is most relevant to what the closest crops you plan on putting in this year and relative to the next year planning on putting in. So there's the rotation, how to enter rotation there. I'm gonna click save. Now that took a good amount of time, and there might be a case where you're like, really, I've got to do this for 12 fields. They're all the same. If that's the case, one of the things you can do is you can copy a field where you're going to choose the field you want to copy to. So in this case, you know, I put in all that complication in grandma's field 14A, and I want to put it into same rotation. So I'll click same rotation. I'm going to click copy and plan this plan, and I'm going to choose from grandma's field. So I know I'm copying to my same rotation field from my grandma field, and it's going to be everything I just put in earlier for my rotation. There might also be a situation where you know that, you know, maybe it's these 3 fields right here. These 3 fields all have the same rotation. You can just say, all right, I'm going to edit this, and you're going to fill in all the same. You can edit some of the pieces of these to overwrite all of them. And to do that, you have to click overwrite all. It's going to start you from scratch, and you're going to fill in the one form that will apply to all 3 of them. So this can be really handy. The only time that there are a couple of ways to think about this. One is that you might have rotations where your rotations are all the same. So it might be like continuous hay, continuous corn, or something more complicated like 4 years of corn and 6 years of hay. So you could use that for this, but in some of those instances, your potential Russell 2 loss might be different. So you could do something a little complicated, like, you know what, all of these are corn silage with cover crop, but you can leave the tons of per acre blank. So you can go back through when you're in your list here and fill those in separately if they're not all the same. So I'm going to say that again, is that there are instances where you might have the same rotation, like your sequence of crops on a field, but your annual soil loss per year is different on them depending on the fields you're in, maybe because of the soil type or maybe because of the practices you're using. So you can either by going to your field list, choosing all the fields that are going to have similar rotations and clicking edit and putting that information here. And you can do that for just the rotation, or you can do it for the rotation and the soil loss. And if you have questions about this, I'm happy to help answer those later. This is a little bit confusing right now, but this is a nice new feature that'll hopefully make the creation process a little bit faster. And then I think the last piece we'll show are crops. And again, like we see with every other section we go to go crop, we have our list of our fields, and then we have, if they're finished, with all the information put in there. If they're blank, we haven't started them yet, or if they're incomplete, meaning we have some information filled in, but not all. So in this example, we'll choose the rectangle field. We'll say no crops found. And then we have this option to add a crop. Or if for whatever reason, you're not going to grow a crop there, you're not going to harvest a crop there, you're not going to add any fertility to that field, you can just say, you know what, I'm going to skip this year for its crop. I'm leaving it fallow. That is probably doesn't happen all that often, but every once in a while it does. And so now we have a way to capture that. It also shows me here that it's blank because I haven't started anything. So I'm going to add my crop. I get this pretty simple form. And I start by choosing my crop. And I'm going to choose corn silage. You notice here there's not a corn silage with cover crop option. It's just choosing one crop. And we have all this help text to help us know how to fill in these text boxes. I'm going to open all those up. We're going to fill in our surface cover percentage, and this is actually feeds into the phosphorus index, the P index. For a row crop like corn, it might be 15%. For a hay crop, it's closer to 80, 85. And we're going to put in the legume content. Legume is anything like vetch or clover or alfalfa. It says required for hay and pasture crops, but we should also just put 0 in to help go crop make its calculations also for any annual crops. And we have cultural practices. So what else might be happening with this crop on this field? So maybe it is corn silage, or as I've chosen above, and we no-till it and we cover crop it. If it's a perennial forage and you reseed, maybe you use a nurse crop. The vining or high canopy and the mulch or living row cover are typically used for vegetable operations. So in most cases, we can kind of ignore those. This crop description, we have perennial, which would be your forages, perennial forages like alfalfa, for example. Annual, if it's a row crop. And then we have this annual overwinter from a previous year. So that might be like, if you're in your plan right now and you have triticale in your field that you are planning on harvesting or foraging this spring, that's what you would choose here. The annual overwinter from previous year. But if you're planning on planting something in the fall, that'll overwinter from 2025 to 2026. Again, like triticale, you might choose annual, will overwinter into next year. This helps go crop know how to roll your plan over next year and how to account for those crops. So this is like present you filling this out well will help future you next year when you meet with us to update your plan. So in this case, got my corn silage, it's annual. I'm going to click save. So now it's telling me that we have this different view that we haven't seen before in go crop yet. And we'll see this also in some other parts of go crop, like our nutrient management plan place, but this is where we first see it. So here we have our corn silage. It's telling me that it's incomplete because I haven't filled out these other 3 pieces. I've already filled in my crop details, but now I'm going to fill in my yield and harvest plan. To do that, I'll click the add button here. And then I will choose these, I will fill out the rest of this accordingly. So if it's a cover crop, I'll mark that. If it's not a cover crop, it won't be harvested, I would click that. In this case, for corn silage, it's neither of those things, right? In the last form, we were talking about cultural practices that go along with that crop. But in this form, we're telling go crop what this crop is. And corn silage, in this case, is neither a cover crop or it's not a cover crop, it won't be harvested, it is going to be harvested. So then I'm gonna put down my total anticipated yield. And this is going to be like, on average, what do you get in general from this field? With the caveat, right, like you might have a pretty low performing hay field, for example, you might only be getting 2 tons per acre off of it. But you also know that if it had adequate fertility, it might bump productivity up. So in that case, you want to put the amount that you think that the field is capable of producing within reason. And then number of harvests, it's a corn silage crop, we're gonna harvest it once. Let's save. The other thing I wanna mention here too, and we can see this in the help text, is that this anticipated yield or potential productive yield is on a dry matter basis. And so, you know, maybe you're pulling a bunch of hay off your field, or maybe you're pulling a bunch of corn silage off your field, and you're counting your loads and you know the average weight of your load, and you're like, well, when I average it out, it's actually like 30 tons of corn silage, or you're like, well, it's actually 8 tons of haylage or whatever it is. But that might be on a wet matter basis, and to think about that more in a dry matter basis to bring it down to what Go Crop's actually asking for. So click save on there. Got my yield plan, my crop details, and my recommendations says that has errors, and the reason why it's telling me that is because I don't have my soil test in for this. So for the purposes of this class, until you have your soil test information entered, just ignore that the nutrient recommendations aren't generating and says has errors if you don't have the nutrient soil test. Do you think I have an example here where I did, as an example, in last class, put in a soil test for grandma's fields, and this is what recommendations look like. So in this case, it's automatically calculating them for me using my book values. And if for any reason you're like, well, these book values aren't right, you should tell us, because that might be a bug. But if you need to adjust them, because maybe you're no-till and that's gonna bump the nitrogen recommendation up 30 pounds in your plan, you can overwrite what Go Crop is recommending by putting it down below in the recommendation section. And one more thing to show before we move on is that just like we showed in the crop rotations and the land info, if you click a couple of these, you can copy your some of what your crop details were from another one. So again, the copy is a copy 2. So maybe my grandma's field, right? I've got all my hay. All my corn. And I want to copy my corn information to these other 3. I'll click the 3 I want to copy to. I'll press the copy button up here. And it will ask me, what do I want to copy? Perennial and overwintered crops. Well, I put my corn silage in, so I'm going to say all crops. I'm just going to copy all my crops to these fields. Right now we're going to default to this plan, so it's the only plan we have. And then from fields, and we'll choose grandma's field. You can kind of tell that the 3 fields I've chosen already are slightly in gray, so we know that those are what we're copying to. And so I only have these 2 other options for what I'm copying from. And it says, all right, we're going to copy all this information over from our from grandma's to these 3 fields that I've selected. I'll copy now. And it can't do that. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's because I don't have prompts in my other field. I did test this out this morning, so this is fun. A little bit of what happens when you're kind of messing around in a dummy account. So let's try again this. Okay. So I copied in that example from grandma's field to same rotation, but what's a little bit funny is that it only copies one part of my crop over. It's not yet set up to also copy over yield and harvest plan. So in the event that you are copying crops from one field to multiple fields, it'll only fill in your surface cover, legume content and practices, and you'll have to like go through your list either this way or through the list section to fill in the rest of that information. And you do that by, again, coming to your field, clicking add, and filling in this information. Yield and the number of harvests. I think that will wrap it up for today. If anyone has any questions about how to enter your land info. Nope. Okay. I think we're set.
I will go ahead and open up those breakout rooms for anyone that wishes to use them.
Okay, all right, yeah, I think we're done for today. Plenty of time to work on homework and we'll see folks next week.